Imagine a mountain without a peak, but with a flat top, surrounded by vertical cliffs that isolate it from the rest of the world. It's a gigantic stone island in the sky, a true tepui. Up there, time has stood still, evolution has taken its own course, and mystery lurks in every rock and plant. Our next stop is Mount Roraima, the lost world of South America, and a touch of the inexplicable. It is located in the famous triple border region, where Brazil, Venezuela, and Guyana converge. The gigantic plateau atop the mountain is literally the meeting point of these three nations. Can you imagine the feeling of being in three countries at once? The secret to its shape, the tepui. What makes Mount Roraima unique is its shape, a tepui. What is a tepui? In the Peman language, tepui means house of the gods. And it's easy to see why. Roraima is a gigantic rocky plateau, with a flat top and vertical sides that reach over 400 meters in height, isolating the summit from the world below. An ancient geography, Mount Roraima is one of the oldest rock formations on the planet, estimated to be almost 2 billion years old. It is a true geological relic, older than dinosaurs themselves. This colossal height and extreme isolation created a completely unique environment. The indigenous peoples of the region, such as the Peman, had known of Mount Roraima for millennia, and it was the basis for many of their legends. However, the first detailed written account that introduced Roraima to the Western world is much more recent. The turning point came in 1884, when the British explorer Everard M. Thurn led the first successful expedition to the summit of the mountain. It was through his accounts and descriptions that the world learned of the existence of such a unique and isolated landscape. Thurn's stories about an inaccessible plateau, teeming with unique flora and fauna, inspired Arthur Conan Doyle's famous book, The Lost World. In other words, the written record not only documented Roraima, but also transformed it into a global legend. The poetic origin of the name. The name Roraima comes from the indigenous Peman language, and its meaning is deeply connected to nature and beauty. The name is a combination of two words. Roroi, meaning large green or blue. Ma, meaning peak or mother. The most popular and poetic translation is Mother of Waters. This name is fitting, as Mount Roraima, with its streams and waterfalls cascading down its sides, is an important source of water for the rivers that feed the region. Nature itself has bestowed upon it a name that is both descriptive and a title of respect. The secret of Roraima lies not only in its plateau shape, tepui, but also in the isolation it provides. The nearly 400-meter-high vertical walls acted as an evolutionary barrier for millions of years. It is as if the summit of Mount Roraima were a biological island, completely separate from the rest of the Earth. On this summit, life followed its own path, creating an environment of mystery and unique species. Endemic species. Up there, you'll find what scientists call endemism. This means that most of the flora and fauna found on the plateau doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Plants that hunt. The soil on the top of Roraima is poor and acidic. To survive, many plants had to adapt, becoming carnivorous. They evolved to capture and digest insects, using them as a source of essential nutrients. Frogs that don't jump. One of the most famous creatures is the red-eyed frog or black frog. It's tiny and so adapted to the environment on top of the tepui that it doesn't jump, it crawls. It's a living example of how isolation can rewrite the rules of nature. The landscape of Roraima is so strange, with its rock formation sculpted by constant rain and mist, that it has inspired fiction. The famous Scottish author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle used stories about the tepuis to create his 1912 novel, The Lost World, in which explorers encounter dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures living on top of a tepui. Can you imagine the feeling of stepping onto a place that inspired dinosaur fiction and holds its own biological secrets? The highest point on Mount Roraima reaches approximately 2,810 meters above sea level, at its summit, known as Maverick Rock. This altitude is impressive, but what truly makes it legendary is not its height, but its appearance. The vertical wall. The plateau is surrounded by vertical walls that drop about 400 meters. To get an idea of the scale, imagine a building over 100 stories tall with no side access. This wall is what isolated the top of the mountain for millions of years. The comparison, Mount Roraima isn't the highest mountain in Brazil, but it is one of the most unique. Its height and, above all, its flat shape make it look like a floating city or a natural fortress. Can you imagine how isolated a place can be, suspended almost 3 kilometers high in the sky, shaped like a table? Mount Roraima is truly unique, but it's not alone. It's simply the most famous of a whole family of mountains with this distinctive shape, the Tepui family. Mount Roraima is part of a group of geological formations called tepuis. Remember that in the local language, Tepui means house of the gods? Well, there are dozens of these mountainous plateaus. Where they are located, almost all of them are concentrated in one region, the Guiana Shield, a geological area that spans parts of Venezuela, Guyana, and Brazil. Venezuela has the greatest concentration of these mountains. The reason for their uniqueness: each tepui is like an isolated island of stone. They were formed by wind and water erosion over millions of years, which eroded the original plateau, leaving only these gigantic blocks with their flat tops and vertical walls. In other words, yes, there are others. And each one is a potential lost world, harboring endemic species and unique ecosystems. Can you imagine an entire region filled with these natural fortresses, which seem to have been sculpted by a giant? The plateau shape, flat top and steep sides, isn't unique to Mount Roraima, but its age and biological isolation certainly are. Shape: Table Mountain. You will find mountains with similar shapes in many parts of the world, where erosion has acted in a similar way. They are called mesas, as in Brazil, buttes or plateaus. The most famous example is Table Mountain in South Africa. You might wonder what the difference is between Mount Roraima and other mountains in the world, both in terms of their formation and their shape. The difference between Roraima and the Himalayas. The difference between Mount Roraima and a mountain like the Himalayas, where Mount Everest is located, lies in the contrast between two opposing geological processes, erosion and collision. Characteristic: Mount Roraima. Extremely old, up to 2 billion years old. Erosion, weathering. It formed when a gigantic plateau was eroded by wind and water, leaving only these rigid, isolated blocks. A passive and rigid structure. It no longer grows. In the case of the Himalayas, the characteristic of the mountain is its youth, very young, tens of millions of years old. They formed through collision, uplift. They formed from the collision of the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates, which pushed the Earth's crust upwards, and their structure is active and still growing. Their height increases every year due to the pressure of the plates. In short, Mount Roraima is a geological relic, the remnants of a much older land. The Himalayas, on the other hand, are a modern creation of the Earth's forces, which are constantly in motion. Shape: Table Mountain. You can find mountains with similar shapes in many parts of the world, where erosion has acted in a similar way. These are called mesas, as in Brazil, buttes or plateaus. The most famous example is Table Mountain in South Africa. You might wonder what the difference is between Mount Roraima and other mountains in the world, both in terms of their formation and their shape. The difference between Roraima and the Himalayas. The difference between Mount Roraima and a mountain like the Himalayas, where Mount Everest is located, lies in the contrast between two opposing geological processes, erosion and collision. Characteristic: Mount Roraima. Extremely old, up to 2 billion years old. Erosion, weathering. It formed when a gigantic plateau was eroded by wind and water, leaving only these rigid, isolated blocks. A passive and stable structure. It no longer grows. In the case of the Himalayas, the characteristic of the mountain is its youth, very young, tens of millions of years old. They formed through tectonic uplift, collision. They formed from the collision of the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates, which pushed the Earth's crust upwards, and their structure is active and still growing. Their height increases every year due to the pressure of the plates. In short, Mount Roraima is a geological relic, the remnants of a much older landscape. The Himalayas, on the other hand, are a modern creation of the Earth's forces, which are constantly in motion.